folks. Welcome back for the first Feature Friday of 2019. I'm your host, Ryan Glover, and this week we're going to be learning how to build action URLs. And you may be thinking, what is an action URL? Well, an action URL is a URL, so an actual address, so something like www.someapp.com/blah or whatever. But the difference is we take advantage of query parameters. So query parameters are everything in the URL after that question mark symbol. So we see things like question mark ID equals and then some text. We can actually piggyback on that data in our UI to trigger actions. So even though that's not really the intent of what that information is for, technically query parameters are for querying things. So you're trying to search for something in your database, and those query parameters say query with this search string or query with these search parameters. We can still piggyback on those as front-end developers and say, okay, we want to use those to tell us what part of our UI do we want to trigger or what action in our application we want to trigger. And this is an excellent way to build things like interactive emails that allow you to engage with your users without having to direct them down a path. So you don't have to say, click here and then click here. You can just say, click this button, and that button is pointed at a URL that will perform some action for them. And so what we're going to do to demonstrate this is we're going to look at a feature in the first upcoming SaaS product from Clever Beagle called Command, which is going to help you to manage and promote your own software product. So what we're going to do is look at implementing action URLs in Command. So this is going to be a real feature that you will have access to in a couple of months inside of Command, and we're going to learn how to wire it up together and see how it works. Alright, so what we're looking at right now is the main cards UI for Command. So one of the conventions in Command is that you'll be able to track your work as cards. And those cards have 5 specific types. And so if we go here to New Card, this is the modal where you'll be adding new cards inside of Command. You can see here we've got our 5 types. We've got idea, feature, bugs, refactors, and chores. And so what we want to do for our action URL is make it so that when we write emails to customers of Command, we can say things like, do you want to start a new bug, or do you want to log a new bug, or maybe do you want to log a new chore? What we can do is power that based on this. So instead of saying, oh yeah, go to the cards UI and click on new card and then select this type, we can use our URL to do all of that work for the user. So they can literally just start typing in. So in this case, if we said, we want you to work on a refactor, we can say, improve speed of downloading, I don't know, we'll say invoices. But the idea being that we're removing friction for our users from having to think about or do these steps physically. We'll just put them where we want them to be relative to whatever the task at hand is. To make all of this work, what I want to do is start by installing this package. So this is called Query String. So this is on npm at query-string or npmjs.com/package/query-string. And what this package does is it allows us to parse the query string. So if we type something up here, so we'll just say, and let's go back over to Command real quick. So we're just going to refresh the page, and then we'll say, okay, our action is do something. Let's put in camel case. So if I visit this URL, right now this doesn't do anything. And what we're going to notice is if I go to my console, and ignore the errors, this is in development still. So what we're going to do is get access to these query params. So if you ever want to do this, you can just type in window.location, and we can see that we get a huge object back from our browser, and it has a bunch of different stuff on it. But the thing we're after is this, search. But what we'll notice, and let's zoom into that, so we'll say window.location.search, all we're really getting back is a string. Now, when it comes to writing our code, and specifically our JavaScript code, we want to be able to look at specific properties. So in this case, I want to know what is the action. I don't want to have to say, oh, I don't know, window.location.search. I don't even know what I'm looking for. It's like something like, I don't know, find. I know that's not the thing, but find action equals, that's a pain in the butt. So what we want to be able to do is just get that back as like a JavaScript object where we have action as do something, and then we can use that like any other data inside of our application. So what we can do is use query string to help us take that string value, so the question mark, action equals, and all of that, and do that parsing for us. So it's going to parse it into an object that we can use inside of our code without a lot of headaches. Okay, so our next step is to go ahead and install this package. So keep in mind, even though I didn't mention this earlier, command is being built on top of pup, so Clever Beagle's boilerplate for building products. I'm using pup and I'm also using fur. So fur is not released yet, but that's going to be the UI kit for building products. So that's a complement to pup. That's going to be Clever Beagle's answer to Bootstrap. So we're using that to build command as well as pup. So this is all the same tooling that we've used in past Feature Fridays. So what I'm going to do here is say meteor npm install, and again, that's because pup is based on meteor. So we're going to say meteor npm I -- save, and we're going to say query -string, and we're going to go ahead and install this. And then what we want to do back in our code is start to think about how we're going to utilize this. So what I've got open here is the view product component inside of command. And so if we jump back over here, and we can knock that out. So view product is this page. So view product is a tab system. So I've got a few different tabs that you can select, but all of them are encapsulated by or a child of the view product page. So what we want to say is if we land on the view product page and the URL contains an action, we want to perform that action. So in this case, again, we want to say if the action is, and we actually haven't come up with this yet, so we should do it now. So we'll say the action is new card. If new card is the action, we know as developers or as the people building command that that means we want to open the new card modal. So that's our first step. So what we're going to do back in our code from the view product page is I'm going to go and import that query string package. So I'm going to say import query string from query -string. And now what we need to do is consider what's happening. So the situation for us is going to be we're dependent on our UI. So we have to say when the view product component mounts, if this exists, do something, meaning if our action URL exists, do something. So what I'm going to do is start by parsing our query params right here. So I'm going to say query params. And so the reason I call it query params is because the package is already called query string. So this separates it a little bit. And we're technically getting back an object of parameters. So what we're going to do is say query string. And that package has a .parse method. And all we have to do is pass it window.location.search. And again, that's that string that we saw down in our console, which has question mark action equals and all of that stuff as a string. And by passing it to query string.parse, we're going to get back an object of query params. And what we can do is just check this out. So I'm going to say, go ahead and console log query params. So we'll save this. And once this reloads, what we should see in our console, immediately as soon as this loads, is our query params. And again, I know, we've got prop type warnings and all that jazz. But where is it? Oof, we got a lot of prop type warnings. There it is. Okay, so we can see here we've got our object with action do something. Now, what I'm going to do is change this. So we're going to change it to new card, which is the action we're actually trying to build something for. So if I say new card, and we gotta go through all the prop type warnings again. I know. Send your hate mail. Not to me, send it to somebody else. There we go. So we get our query params object, and we've got action defined set to new card. So literally, whatever we put up here is going to show up here. Now, what's neat about this is we're not just limited to one query parameter. So the way that query parameters work is after the question mark, any additional parameters can be added using the and symbol. So we can say and then give another name. And this is going to be important because remember, we talked about when we open this up, we don't just want to open the modal, we also want to select one of these types. So we need to know which type we're trying to select. So let's just pick something. Yeah, earlier we talked about refactors. So we'll say type equals refactor. So again, if I go to this URL and we go through all of our warnings, I know, it's the end of the world. I know. There it is. So we get our action new card, and now we also get type refactor. But the neat thing is we're getting this back as a JavaScript object. So back in our code, now we can utilize this to actually do something or perform the actual action that we're after. So I'm realizing now that I've actually made a grave mistake in our code, because even though we are technically back in our browser here looking at the view product UI, or the view product page inside of command, what we're technically rendering on screen is this is known as the cards component. And so what we need to do, and when I say cards component, what I mean is when we click on the cards tab, so back here if we click this tab, so I'll click over to roadmap, back to cards. So when we did that click, we were rendering the product cards component. And technically speaking, that's where we're going to want to do our component did mount fetch of query params. And the reason why is that product cards is actually where our modal is rendered. So what we're going to do is relocate this. And I'm sure we've all been down this road before where we think we're genius and we spend who knows how long writing some code, and then next thing you know, oh yeah, we did it wrong. So guess what we're going to do? We're just going to pretend like that didn't happen and we're going to move it. So where I'm at here is in the UI components, and this is the product cards component. Now again, this is just like pup, or actually this is pup. This is based on pup. So the organization and the structure here is identical. These are just custom components that I've added to pup to make it into command. So what we're going to do inside of product cards is port over this query string stuff, because I'm just a big old doofus. So we're going to copy this over. We're not going to save anything just yet. We're going to do that, and then let's snag this, and this looks clean now, so let's save that one. And then back over here, I honestly don't remember if this has a component did mount. It does not. Okay, so what we can do is just funk that right on top. Now, nothing's changed in terms of the behavior of our code. All we're doing is moving it to a slightly better location so that this actually makes sense in the code later. So what we want to do, again, when this component mounts, so let's go ahead and save this, make sure this is still clear what's going on here. So if I come back over to the browser, and it's going to do its saving, and it's going to reload, and gee golly gosh, wouldn't you know, there we go. We still get our query params object here. So we've got action with new card and type refactor. And again, that's because we've put those as query params in our URL. So back in our code, what we want to do now is utilize those to make our code work. Now, in order to make our code work, there's something that you need to understand about how command is working, or how this part of the UI is working. So the thing that we're trying to open is rendered down here. So this is at the bottom of the product cards component, and this is the new card modal. So what we're trying to do is say, hey, the action is creating a new card, so we want to open this modal. And if we look, the way that we dictate whether or not it's open is via this prop. So the open prop is set to this.state.showNewCardModal. And so this is actually quite easy. So what we need to do is just set showNewCardModal on state to true. And if all of our other code is working, that should just work out of the box. We shouldn't have to do anything special. So what we're going to do is jump back up to component did mount, and I'm going to say if query params, and we should just be safe. So let's say if query params and query params, and we know that what we're looking for is an action. So if that exists, we're going to do some stuff. Now, there's probably 101 ways, honestly, to write this code. I'm going to write it in the most obvious way, but this is one of those things where you want to think about refactors. So one of the things that you can track inside of command are refactors, and these are good things to write down while you're working. So even though I really did wish that command was fully built to the point where I could do this, because I would like to write this stuff down, what you can do is say, okay, I like this code, but I can improve it. So let's log a refactor to say improve how we handle action URLs inside of the product cards component. But for now, we're not going to worry about being too fancy with code. We just want to get it to work. So inside of this block, what I want to do is say, well, what is the type of action? And so we'll say if query params, you know what, let's just make this for this one action, because we don't want to overthink the code. That's silly. So we'll say query params.action. Yeah, this is a bit verbose, but it does the trick. So we're going to say if query params and query params.action and query params.action, let's do this as equals. So we're going to do a triple equals, and we'll say new card. So if we're doing a new card, we know that we want to set state to trigger our modal. So what we're going to say is, if we go back down here, we're looking for show new card modal. And actually, this is how you can tell this is totally in development. I don't have a default value for this. So let's pop one on here now. So we're just going to thunk it on the end, and we'll say false by default. And so back down here then, again, because if our URL contains this action, we do want to open it. So we're going to set it to true. And what are we getting? Oh, we're getting an error. Do not use set state in component did mount. This is our linter yelling at us. So this is one of those situations where we have to be a little bit clever. So I think we can get around this by saying, let's say handle URL action. And now we're starting to see some room where we could separate this out into a module or something like that. But again, we're not going to stress about that because it's not worth our time. We just want to see something working on screen. And this is yapping about order of our functions. Still, what's it want? Placed after set active list. Okay, well, all right, Mr. Fussy Pants, we'll put you down here. And you're probably going to yell, no? You're happy? Cool. Okay, so what we're going to say is handle URL action, and I think we can get away with this. Technically, it'll get around the linter, and we shouldn't have to worry about it too much. So what it was complaining about is you shouldn't call set state in component did mount for a number of different reasons. Some I understand, some I don't, but it didn't like that. But all we had to do was obscure it behind another class method on our component, and we can call it indirectly. So we're still running the same exact code, but the difference is we're not calling it directly in component did mount. So, ha! Ryan 1, linter 0. So we're going to keep cruising down here, and remember we're saying show new card modal true if query params action exists and it's equal to new card. So let's see, because technically our existing URL should get this to work. So once we get a refresh here, we should see our modal pop up for us. And hot damn, look at that, we got a modal. So keep in mind, if I go to this URL directly, so I'm going to drop our query params, nothing happens. But if I add action equals, we'll leave type off for now, we'll just say new card. So now if we do this, boom, we've directly shot our user right to the new card modal. There's nothing that we have to explain. We've already put them where we want them to be. So the last step of this is that we need to also make sure that we're setting the type. So if we go back down here, I gotta find the thing. Ah, that's because it's in the new card modal itself. So we gotta open that up. And the new card modal is rendering a component called card type selector. And we can see that it has a default state value of this state card type. So card type selector, if we pull that up, is this goober. So it's got our 5 different types, and it's this nice little button UI here. So what we need to do is tell that component which one to select. So we have to communicate this in 2 ways. We have to communicate it to the selector, and you'll notice if we select a type, our UI beneath that is also aware of the type that we picked. So we're saying, like, what's an actionable title for this bug, or what's required. Actually, hey, there's a typo. What's required for this chore to be done? But the idea is that we need to communicate that type that we've selected, or that type that's in our URL, both to the selector as well as the entire new card modal. So what we're going to do is we'll close that for a sec, and we need to say, let's see, default selected type, this state card type, and we're saying, let's take a look at our new card modal. So we're going to have to add some props to new card modal. So what I'm going to do, and this is where you got to be careful because you can get really messy with props. And this is a very specific feature, so we want to be careful not to be ridiculous here. So new card modal, and let's just say selected type, because that's generic enough and it's not purpose built just for handling actions. And I could see some reasons in the future internally in the software and inside of command where we would want to trigger the selected type and tell the modal about it. So we're going to say selected type, and we know that that is going to come from our action URL. So there's a few different ways around this, and technically speaking, because we're already setting state, we may as well take advantage of it. And again, there's plenty of room for refactoring here, but what we can do is just piggyback on state because we're already utilizing it. And what I'm going to do is set this to the default. So the default type is idea inside of command. So, or rather I should say inside of the new card modal. So you'll notice up here, where is it? The default card type is set to idea. So technically, because we're adding this action URL feature after we've already implemented the default mode, we're going to have to clean this up, but for now we can just cruise with it. So we've got our selected type on state, and so what that means is down here we're going to also say, and let's think about how to do this. So I'm going to create a state object. And so I know that if I'm inside of this block, we're already in the new card action. So I'm going to pop that up here. But then I'm also going to say if query params dot, what did we say was type. We don't care what the type is. We just care that it exists. So if it exists, I'm going to say state.type. Actually, be careful. So we got to say state.selectedType. So let's copy that. Be lazy bones. We'll say state.selectedType is equal to query params.type. And now we can replace this object with state. So what we're saying is this is no matter what going to be passed if we're inside of the query params action equals new card block. So if this code is running, no matter what, we're always going to show the new card modal. But type is optional. As we saw, our modal opens just fine, but we may not have a type. So we have to be careful and do a conditional. So we're going to say if there's a type, assign to this state object the selected type equal to that query params.type value. So that's only if it exists, and then we pass that whole state value back to our set state call. So now, if all is working well, we should have our action as well as our type firing or storing on state. And so down here, we're going to say this.state.selected type. And so now that's getting us down to the point where our new card modal can be told about our default type. So what I want to say here is this.props. And you know what? We're using class properties inside of pup. But what I'm going to do to make sure this is super clear is I'm going to add a React Constructor. So I'm going to change this a little bit. So the idea here is just to add clarity for you folks who are watching. This is one of those potato type of things. Some geek is probably having an absolute aneurysm now watching this, saying like, "Oh, I can't use the constructor." But I'm going to use the constructor just so we understand this next step, which is we want to load props that are being passed to new card modal into state by default. And so this is going to work in part and not in another, and I'll show you what I mean in a second. So we're going to say props dot, in this case we said selected type, not on select type, selected type, or idea. So make sure I got that right. So yeah, it's selected type, and then we've got props dot selected type. We need to add it to our prop type validation. So I'm going to do that. We'll say selected type, and we know that's a string. And it may not be there. So this actually works out. So what we're going to do, because this is an optional type, it may or may not be here, we're going to add default props to our components. We're going to say default props. I'm going to say selected type. So default props are literally what should React pass to this component by default if this value isn't here. And if we go back up to the top here, we can see that we had idea here before. And so instead of this messy or syntax, what we can do is get rid of that and totally drive this using props.selectedType. And the reason we can get away with that is because of default props. So if we do pass selected type as prop, we'll set that. But if not, we can tell React to fall back to this default prop. And so no matter what, we're going to set some value onto the default state of the new card modal. And so this is just one part. So right now we should be setting state of selected type. That should be getting to new card modal. But I have a feeling that it's not going to work exactly. So what I want to do, and we'll notice that it did default to idea, which is still good. But I'm going to add and type, and we'll set it, yeah, we'll leave it as refactor. So let's see if it does it. But I have a feeling it's not going to work. No. And I can show you why. So the problem here is that if we consider this UI, so let's go back to here, and I'm just going to refresh the page. We still have our action URL, so let's clear those out as well. So as soon as this page loads, even though we don't see it on screen, our modal is being rendered to the page, which means back here in our code, if we look at, this is going to be on product cards. So remember, we've got view product as the page that loads the tabs, and it's always going to load cards as the first tab by default. So we're loading the product cards component, and internally in the product cards component, it is rendering new card modal. The visibility of new card modal, again, is driven by this open prop. So even though we don't see it visually on screen as users, it's technically there. And so the problem is that by the time we go through the process of managing the action URL and all of that, it's looking like our constructor has already fired. So we're not technically getting the selected type we think we're getting. At least that seems to be the case. So what I'm going to do is pop a log in here, and I'm going to say selected type from props. Now, I'm almost certain that this is the case, because if it was working, we should at least see the selected type. It would help if I actually logged it. We should see that type automatically selecting in the UI itself. So most likely what we're going to have to do here is add some sort of like component will receive props kind of hook to make sure that this works. Yeah, and that seems to be the case. So if we look in our console here, I know, yeah, prop type warning. Did it actually log it? Selected type from props. Yeah, so it's defaulted to idea, even though we've got this. So let's do one more check, just a sanity check to make sure this is behaving how we think. So I'm going to say right here, just inline, console log, we'll say selected type in product cards. I feel like yelling today, so I'm going to type in all caps. So I'm going to say this state selected type. Okay, so let's see if we're getting what we think we're getting. So again, if our code up here, where are we doing this? So when we say handle URL action, we call that on component did mount. If all of that stuff is behaving and it's doing what we think it's doing, we should be getting selected type on state. So if we come back over here, we do. So we can see selected type in product cards refactor. So pretty much what's happening here is when or by the time we've called this code, we've already rendered the modal, and so we do get it. So we see that we get multiple outputs of these, so that means we're triggering re-renders in React, and it is the correct value, but by the time the new card modal gets it, it's already past its constructor, and so we don't actually set it. So the way around this is to go ahead and save that. So we're going to get rid of that console log, and we're going to get rid of this one as well. And now this is not a quirk of this code or anything like that. This is just a common problem that comes up with React, especially when you want to set some default state. So what we can do is add component will receive props, meaning this component is about to receive props. And what we can do is get access to the props that are inbound to this component. So literally whenever the props to a component change, we can say inside a component will receive props, do something. And do something is totally contingent on what product you're building and why you're building it and all that stuff. And so I'm guessing this is yapping about order again, so let's move this up here. There's robots and linters and all that good fun. Yeah, okay, so inside of component will receive props, what we can do is say, okay, if and I got to think this one through. So we're going to say if next props dot selected type. So let's be smart about this. So we'll say if next props dot selected type and next props dot selected type does not equal this dot state dot card type, then we want to do something. So we're trying to be sensible or at least responsible here and say there's no point in us overriding state if the value is already what we want it to be. So in this case, if our action URL was setting the type to idea, we already know that the default is idea, so there's literally no point for us to overwrite that. So we can check it here and we'll say, okay, if it's not that, set it to this. So we're going to say set card type to next props dot selected type. And so if we save this, and jump back to our browser, I have a feeling this is at least going to move the ball a little further downfield. Let's see what we get. All right. So there we go. We've got our modal opening, and we've got our typeset to refactor. And again, let's change this just so you don't think I'm pulling the covers over your eyes. We'll change it to chore and see that it works exactly as we want. We can also see that it's taking care of the rest of the content in the modal. So it's saying, you know, log a new chore, and what's an actionable title for this chore, and Ryan can't spell what's curried for this chore to be done. But there you go. So it is working and it is doing what we want. Now, again, this is optional. So I can copy those and I can go back to the URL and nothing happens. But if we have some sort of use case in our product where we want to have actions that we can point people to, we can do that. So this is, again, a really excellent way to build engagement in your product or with your product, and make sure that users are being pointed exactly where you want them to. So technically where I'd use this and where I intend to use this for command is during the onboarding process. So after somebody signs up, one of the things that I'd like to do is say, I don't know, after a few days following your sign up, so while you're still during your trial, what I'd like to do is say, hey, try adding a chore or try adding a refactor, something like that. And instead of me having to explain the steps, like we talked about at the beginning of the video, now I can just link a button inside of the email to this URL, and we know that, hey, guess what? As soon as they get to the page, they're going to get access to that feature, and they're going to have an input highlighted. So they literally don't have to click a thing. They can just say, oh, you know what? I need to add an S3 bucket for user profile photos. Hot damn. That's pretty cool. All right, and with that, I'm going to stop saying hot damn, even though it's the most fun thing in the world to say, and wrap up this Feature Friday. So I really appreciate you folks watching. Thanks for coming back for 2019. If you haven't already, please do click the subscribe button on our profile. And also, if you're really eager to get these as soon as they're available, make sure to tap the bell so that way you get a notification on YouTube itself as soon as it's published. So thanks again for watching, and we will see you next week for another Feature Friday.